I was staring at the screen and I realized today is 14th of October. And the first thing that crossed my mind is that my wife and I missed our wedding anniversary last week. October is always difficult. So yeah, I've got to go back and perhaps cook something tonight. Let me congratulate the World Bank for what is the 30th edition of Malaysia Economic Monitor. And it's a partnership that began 15 years ago. And it has grown into a fundamental sounding board for our policy making. And the Ministry of Economy is grateful for your efforts and insights. And obviously, we hope we will be able to continue this partnership for many, many years to come. There are certain mixed things that we have to start thinking about. The longer we delay these realities, the slower our reforms will take shape. And in the space of agriculture, that can prove detrimental to the welfare of Malaysia's economy, which I suppose we already recognize by now. The first trend is our demographic. Malaysia currently is home to about 34 million people, but that is set to increase to 45 million by 2050. At the same time, we have to contend with the second trend, which is our import dependence. In 2022, our food trade deficit was about 31 billion ringgit. We import 1.7 times the value of food we export. Obviously, this has a squeezing effect. With more people in Malaysia, there will be a greater demand for imported food to sustain consumption. And anyone in our position in government will also recognize that this is also a security threat, not just on food, but the functioning of the economy. With many countries lately reverting to protectionism, we have to seriously question if we have the adequate capacity and supply to feed ourselves in the future. And this is especially concerning when we consider the third trend, which is history of development. And Malaysia is a living proof of that, because like most developing countries, we pivoted away from agriculture in an attempt to diversify our economies. Since 1974, agriculture's contribution to our GDP steadily declined from about 30% to just under 10% in 2022. Commodities took a backseat and made way for manufacturing and construction. And again, and we have to contend this even in meetings at the highest level of governments, the conventional view always favored buildings over paddy fields. And we have this unique problem in Malaysia because land is under the jurisdiction of state governments. And those state governments that allocate lands for agriculture or paddy fields always feel that they are punished economically because they collect less taxes and development levies compared to more developed states. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, our challenge is that the agriculture industry suffers from a modernization gap. If we look at productivity, the value added per hour worked has actually declined from 25 ringgit 20 cent in 2015 to about 24 ringgit 80 cent in 2023, whereas manufacturing and services are roughly twice as productive. And consequently, this has a downward pressure on wages. in agriculture, a sector where employment is still actually growing at 4.2% annually, but most of it comes from rural areas, which makes our job as National Development Agency at Ministry of Economy more difficult, because we have to ensure balanced development regionally, and there will always be contention that federal government accelerates economic development in more rural area, not so much by economic activities but by infrastructure spending. And therefore matching the value that you get from infrastructure spending becomes more challenging as we go along, notwithstanding the fiscal constraints. But most importantly, and this is what we have been looking at the Ministry of Economy, the biggest effect is the destructive social implications. If we are not able to bring up modern farming and agriculture as a key economic activities in this country, what will happen in the future is that we condemn people with lower wages, we worsen the rural-urban divide, and we will exacerbate this sense of being left behind. And this is already happening. So while Malaysia tries to punch above our weight in semiconductor, in energy transition, it is not lost on us how important farming and agriculture is to the overall social fabric of the country. And we identified 5 strategic sectors last year, which this government will focus, which we'll call high growth, high value. The 4 are known and not surprising, I suppose: advanced electronic and semiconductors, energy transition, digital and tech, battery, and whatever connected to REE, rare earth minerals. But one strategic sector was often left behind in any discussion at the national level, which is modernizing our agriculture and introducing modern farming. And I always argue this internally and as well as to the public. It is a lot more difficult to convince investors either to relocate or to build a manufacturing plant in the middle of nowhere in less developed area. The economics just doesn't make sense. So they tend to congregate around the more developed corridors in the West Coast. But the wages level is not necessarily better than what a modern farming facility can offer. And therefore, for less developed corridors in this country, what makes sense to us is to build a national scale which can bring down the investment per unit and transform agriculture from what was before, which is basically something that a family has to work on their own, into an industry where people are employed on these modern farms. And I'll share with you some of the early results of our early pilot tests, and it's proven that they earn at par or even better than those in manufacturing sectors in the West Coast. And we are always aware that if we fail to address this issue of the need to scale up modern farming in this country, we might have to contend with a Detroit dilemma one day. If you take Detroit, beyond Robocop, we can see what happens to Detroit. Industry was eventually scaled down, and consequently it caused a backlash at the ballot box. And that's why it is very important for us to understand the social dynamics that is also happening now, and to continuously make the case for modernization of agriculture, because it's not just economics. There is a real social impetus for government to act quickly on this. Of course, the challenge is how to do it. I think people often criticize me for not listening enough. Let me share one perspective. When I took this job, sit down and went through it, in terms of the diagnosis of the problem, it's been there for a long while. Studies after studies, a lot of it contributed by World Bank, or plans after plans did recognize a series of issues. Some were structural in nature, some were market practices, but all these issues had been diagnosed and identified. What is difficult is to come up with the right program design. It's the program design, in my opinion, that makes a difference. And in the past, if we were to total up the amount of national allocation that went into agriculture, it's actually quite a lot. Some of it were direct cash handouts. It's just that, in my opinion, the program design was somewhat problematic because the business and operational risks were not mitigated for these farmers. What governments often do is to allocate some money and to provide either cash capital or seed capital or equipment capital, but the rest, once they get this capital, good luck to you. And it stems from perhaps the attitude that farming and agriculture is somewhat primitive and easy to do. It is not. And now we have to contend with climate change and everything else. This is actually a very complicated sector, as complicated as anything else in this country. So when the program design was somewhat problematic, no matter how much was allocated, it just didn't move the needle, because for a farming venture to be economically viable, it needs to have a certain scale. And for it to be modern, to have a certain scale, you need a lot more than the 20,000 or 30,000 capital or handouts that governments provide. It will not stand on its own. Never mind the fact that for an agriculture venture to be of certain scale, you need the land of certain scale, which the lack of land is perhaps one of the biggest impediments for us to do this. So among the first thing that we attempted to do was to recognize these problems with program designs. And we understood that we have to try to build scale. And that's when we realized that we require a new economy argument for agriculture. And that has been included in policy documents. Our ambition is to revive and refocus agriculture as a growth driver for the new economy, because the dollars and cents now selling financial appeal to people to take up farming. And we hope that if we persist on this, we will be able to increase productivity that eventually will result in higher wages and output, and obviously manage the other side of the whole equation, which is to minimize social division and food dependence. Now, again, it's given that if we were to do this, we have to embrace technology in stages. What I'm very careful to do is not to preach adoption of technology without sympathizing and empathizing with how difficult it is for your regular Joes on the ground to adopt it. It's easy for us to say that this is important. They know it. And it's easy for us to tick the box at the policy makers level and say, we've rolled this out, we've rolled that out. But unless it makes economic case for them on the ground, we will continue to propagate the mistakes of the past, which is policy makers have a long list of what they've worked on, but it did not cascade down, or the adoption is very low from the stakeholders. That's why, and this is where I suppose some of us at the Ministry of Economy sometimes caught it controversial, because we tend to say things that people don't like to hear. When it comes to, for example, technology and agriculture, our view is that the traditional approach of creating an elaborate digitalization blueprint is dated. We don't believe in it, because the fear is that this thick blueprint is good for us here, it's good for policy analysts, but it makes hardly any sense to the stakeholders on the ground. You know, we can't expect the average fisherman to read these thick documents and change their practices. It just doesn't work like that. You know? And what we attempted over the last 20 months was to come out with an MVP approach, minimum viable product or minimum viable policy design, and test it first and to see how we can increase adoption. By building digital use cases within segments of the value chain, test it rigorously, and then we identify the gaps. Hopefully that will allow us to be able to scale it up nationally. And then we talk the dollars and cents about the allocation, rather than talking about how many billions and then just allocate it and good luck with the implementation. And I'm happy that to a certain extent we had some early results. In fact, at the Ministry of Economy, we did a survey before we attempted many things. And one of the things that we wanted to find out, especially with the younger population, what sectors or segments of the economy that excite them most. You'll be surprised, our younger population in Malaysia don't necessarily associate buildings or semiconductors with modernity. They actually equate and associate modern farming with modernity. And by far a larger section of our population look forward and got excited about modern farming than anything else. I suppose it fits into the Gen Z millennials idea of work-life balance, you know, therapeutic, working, playing gadgets, and then everything got done, you know. So it didn't surprise us. And that was one of the reasons why when we look at poverty eradication, we were looking at how do we move away from just giving allocation and cash handouts? How do we get people to participate, especially in large-scale modern farming? And so far, we are in the process of scaling up some of these early MVPs. We started by taking federal land in 16 locations in the country. We have a lot of federal lands and state lands, but most of these are not known to people. Actually, I don't know where they are. It's sitting somewhere in someone's book somewhere. And these federal lands are allocated to federal government, waiting for federal allocation for something to happen, either to build schools or to build, Mardi Research Center. It takes time. So usually governments acquire the lands first, it goes into federal land banks. The state has the same process as well. And what we realized is that rather than asking poor farmers or people who would want to have a start in modern farming, go and source their own land and went through that frustration, because if you were to lease or to buy 20 hectares of land, and if you have that kind of money, you wouldn't have thought about agriculture in the first place. You would have gone and buy shares and do something else. So what we did is that we took these lands and we allocate for modern farming, and the federal governments use federal allocation to put together the modern infrastructure. And then instead of the participants putting their own money, they got employed on site in a way that it functions almost like cooperative. They are given half an acre's plot. They have to meet certain requirements. The government looks after the whole value chain and supply chain, all the way from infrastructure to technical expertise, all the way to off-takers. We make sure that the off-takers enter into a price agreement to make sure that these farmers are protected from fluctuations in prices. So it's a way that we think we can combine poverty eradication and also building the infrastructure for modern farming across the country. And I know that some of you could have come across some of the TikTok and so on. I was very concerned in the beginning because we put a baseline. This kind of federal project must be able to give at least 2,000 ringgit income per month, because this is to bring them out of hardcore poverty. And lo and behold, so far, the number is a lot better than what we anticipated in some areas, and it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the quality, it depends on the commercial arrangement. But some participants earn as much as 5,600 ringgit a month. And that's a lot more than even what a semiconductor engineer can earn. And the beauty of it is that we are no longer confined to the West Coast or to the more developed corridors to create these kinds of employment. This is as suitable, even more suitable, in the lesser developed areas. And for that, in 2025 onwards, we hope to be able to allocate a lot more in order to create the kind of employment and reposition, especially the east coast of Malaysia and Sabah, as the food basket of Malaysia. And on that, I'm encouraged to see the World Bank adopt a similar approach. Your pilot programs have tested the feasibility and viability of digital agriculture technologies. I've gone through your report, and the result shows that these DATs can help reduce production costs, increase sales volumes, and lower mortality rates. I was talking to Dr. Zafir about DATs just now. One of our pilot or pet project going forward at the Ministry of Economy, working with the Ministry of Agriculture, is to really resolve the structural issues component by component. We are working on the infrastructure and the entry cost. Hence, the approach to use government lands for governments to pay for the capital outlay in the beginning and so on. But the other impediment to scaling up modern farming and agriculture in this country is very much about market transparency. If you compare the ex-farm price of a produce with what finally we have to pay at supermarket or market, is the difference is huge. I went through that process myself. I went and checked. Sometimes it can be double. So somehow the value parking of the whole value and supply chain of agricultural produce from farm to market is still very problematic in this country. And it's mostly for the lack of more transparent supply chain and transparent pricing. So that's something that we will attempt to do. And we hope, as we begin to tackle component by component, we started with the infrastructure bit, we need to be able to see what we can do with the market bit. And I'm sure 5-10 years down the line, we will see a rejuvenation of agriculture and modern farming in this country. And before I end, this is the one thing that I cannot accept when we plan for the economy. For a country that consumes so much of different types of produce, the fact that we were contented to increasingly rely on exports. I can understand more difficult crops like rice and that's has to be done at a huge scale and huge investments. But if you take chilies, right? This is a country that uses chilies for anything, practically anything. We consume so much chili. And our self-sufficiency level is only about 20% plus. We imported more than 70% of chilies for a country that relies heavily on chilies. And there's nothing stopping us from managing our chili production so that even if we are not able to scale up our SSL for rice, at the very least, we begin to move the needle for the lesser types of produce like chilies or what else? Ginger. We eat a lot of ginger in this country, and it's not that difficult to plant gingers. But in the past, I think because the attitude is always that let's just buy this. We are better off doing other things and let's just buy this. So much so that I think our SSL for ginger is also around 20%-ish. So the components are slowly falling into place. As we speak, the national census for agriculture is being completed. And the last time this was done was in 2005, I think. So we have lived with an outdated set of data for almost 20 years for our agriculture. And I'm very excited to see that exhaustive report after this, because it will allow us to recalibrate many things. It will recalibrate our baselines. It will allow us to plan our land use better. It will allow us to know for certain how many people actually are involved in agriculture. Because on the one hand, we have this list of recipients of agricultural subsidy every year that goes to the billions. But somehow you don't know how many of these people actually are farmers. So all this will fall into place in October. And it's just a good timing because we are in the process of finalizing RMK 13. And I hope that the chapter on modern farming and agriculture will be one of the most exciting and eye-opening for us, for our stakeholders, and for the public to see. So, thank you very much. We have a lot to do, and I'm glad that the work of World Bank in this country is always aligned to our pet projects. I don't know which is which. I don't know whether we tell you first or you kind of read what we are doing. But I'm glad that it's always aligned, and that has allowed us the facility for soundboarding, because it's challenging trying to repivot the country from underinvestments in agriculture for a long time that has created the kind of structural defects that we have in the industry. It will take some time. It will take more than one Malaysian plan to reposition modern farming and agriculture. And I hope this will add to the momentum of the economy. We are still subjected to so many risks, but I'm hoping that with a clear focus, with a good narrative, and for governments to try our best to do what is necessary, albeit very difficult, this provides the kind of messaging that our economy needs going forward. And inshallah, we'll be going through another round of reform proposals for the government this week, and this time on our development budget expenditure. Is on the processes, is on the philosophy, is on the costing. Again, some of us cannot accept that sometimes it costs double or triple for government to build something that a private sector can build at a third of the cost. It's not easy, but it's necessary. And I think these bits and pieces will continue to provide guidance for our economy to navigate all the challenges coming. And with that, thank you very much. And I welcome as many of you to become modern farmers after this. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.